Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. When the Stars Fell. The air in the Australian Outback carried the ancient scent of red earth and the faint medicinal whisper of distant eucalyptus. Caramel of profound and patient solitude, the kind Carmen had come to crave. Tonight, it was just her and the universe, the best kind of company. She moved with the practiced ease of a musician tuning her instrument, her hands gliding over the cool metal body of the Meade telescope. Each click of a latch, each turn of a knob was a familiar comfort, a small anchor in the overwhelming vastness that was beginning to swallow the landscape. In her late 30s, Carmen possessed a quiet intensity. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her eyes, the colour of rich coffee, held a galaxy of their own, a mix of scholarly curiosity and a deep, well-guarded sorrow. She was an astronomy teacher, a woman who found more solace in the predictable celestial dance of gas and fire millions of light years away than in the chaotic, unpredictable orbits of human connection. The observatory, a modest, slightly worn dome hunkered low against the horizon, was her sanctuary. As the last vestiges of bruised purple and faded orange bled from the western sky, the first diamond... Chips of starlight appeared. A sigh of contentment escaped her lips. This was why she had driven 6 hours from the nearest town, for this perfect, untainted darkness. It was the crunch of boots on the gravel path that broke the spell. Carmen tensed, her hand freezing on the telescope's focus wheel. She wasn't expecting anyone. This place was a well-kept secret among serious stargazers, not a tourist hotspot. A man emerged from the deepening shadows, his silhouette tall and broad-shouldered. He carried a camera bag slung over one shoulder and had the slightly disoriented look of someone who'd been on the road for a very long time. "Is this the right place for the Meteor shower? Feels a bit desolate," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble that seemed to carry a wry smile. Carmen's shoulders relaxed fractionally. He didn't seem like a threat, just another soul drawn to the night sky. "It's perfect," she replied, her tone even, betraying none of her initial apprehension. "The less light pollution, the better. Desolate is what you want." The man stepped closer, into the faint glow of her small set-up lantern. He looked to be in his early 40s, his face etched with the fine lines of someone who had spent a lot of time squinting into the sun. There was a tiredness in his blue eyes, but also a spark of genuine interest. "Damian," he said, extending a hand. "Carmen," she returned, her handshake firm but brief. "Damian, the travel blogger," he elaborated, as if anticipating the question. "Figured I'd trade the usual beach sunsets for something a little more cosmic. Came to see the Perseids put on a show." "They should," Carmen affirmed, turning her attention back to her telescope. "Peak activity is in a few hours. You're early." "Story of my life," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He set his bag down and began to unpack a tripod and camera with a quiet efficiency that mirrored her own. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the soft clicks of his equipment and the gentle hum of Carmen's telescope tracking the slow spin of the Earth. It was a silent ballet of two strangers, each preparing their own small station from which to witness the heavens. The quiet that settled between them wasn't awkward. It was cool. The immensity of the desert seemed to absorb any need for trivial chatter. Damian finally broke it. "You do this often?" "As often as I can," Carmen said, her gaze fixed on the eyepiece. She was calibrating, aligning her view with a bright guide star. "It's my job in a way. I teach astronomy." "Ah, so you're the expert," he said with a soft chuckle. And here I am, just a guy with a nice camera hoping to get lucky. Sometimes that's the best way to see it, she admitted, pulling back from the telescope. Without all the names and numbers, just looking up. She gestured to the sky, which was now a profound, bottomless black velvet, strewn with a breathtaking quantity of stars. The Milky Way was a thick, shimmering river of light, so clear it seemed almost close enough to touch. Damian let out a low whistle of appreciation. Wow, you don't get that in Sydney. No, Carmen agreed, you don't. A distant, lonely howl drifted on the dry air, a dingo calling out to the infinite night. The sound amplified the sense of isolation, of being at the very edge of the world. But for the first time in a long time, Carmen didn't feel entirely alone. She looked over at Damian, who was now staring up at the sky, his face tilted towards the cosmos with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. He was a stranger, yes, a temporary disruption to her solitude. But as she watched him, she felt an unfamiliar flicker of something other than a desire to be left alone. It was curiosity, and in the vast, silent desert, under a sky preparing to fall, that felt like a seismic shift. The night deepened, wrapping the desert in a cool, silent embrace. The preliminaries were over. Damian had his camera set for long exposures, its shutter opening and closing with a soft, satisfying click, and Carmen's telescope was perfectly aligned, though she found herself ignoring it. The main event had begun. The first meteor was a sudden silver slash against the canvas of the Milky Way, so fast it was almost an illusion. Whoa, Damian breathed, a sound of pure wonder. A second one followed, then a third streaking across the starfield like divine calligraphy. They had both abandoned their equipment, now sitting on separate blankets a few feet apart, necks craned, gazes fixed on the celestial display. The silence between them had transformed, softened by the shared spectacle. It was no longer the silence of two strangers, but the comfortable quiet of mutual reverence. Carmen had brought a thermos, and the scent of chamomile tea mingled with the dry desert air as she poured 2 steaming cups. She offered one to Damian, and their fingers brushed as he took it. A small, unexpected jolt, like static electricity. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than before. He took a sip, the warmth a welcome counterpoint to the cooling air. "It's funny," he began, his eyes still on the sky. "You travel to escape things, but some things, they just follow you, no matter how many miles you put between yourself and them." It was an unprompted confession, a small vulnerable stone tossed into the quiet pool of their shared space. Carmen didn't press, but she recognized the sentiment. It resonated with a painful frequency deep within her. "I was supposed to be in Norway last winter," Damian continued, his voice wistful, "to see the northern lights with my fiancé. We didn't make it. The trip, or us." He took another sip of tea, the silence that followed heavy with unspoken history. Carmen watched a particularly bright meteor burn a brilliant green as it disintegrated in the atmosphere. She understood the need to attach memories to the sky. It was safer. The stars held your secrets without judgment. "The stars don't judge," she said, echoing her own thoughts aloud. "They don't ask for anything. They just are. Sometimes that's all you need." He turned to look at her then, his face illuminated by the faint starlight. He saw it in her eyes. A quiet strength, yes, but also a sadness she carried like a well-worn map, its creases softened by time, but its roots still deeply etched. He felt an immediate intuitive kinship. This wasn't the brittle sadness of a recent wound. It was the settled, heavy grief of something permanent. "You sound like you know that feeling," he said gently. Carmen gave a small, sad smile. She thought of Leo, of his infectious laugh and the way he'd trace constellations on her back. He had loved nights like this. "I used to come out here with my husband," she said, the words feeling strange in her mouth after so long. "He was an astronomer too. He believed the universe was full of second chances." She paused, her gaze lost somewhere in the Andromeda galaxy. He never got his. The confession hung in the air between them, as raw and real as the ancient rocks surrounding them. Damian didn't offer platitudes or apologies. He just nodded slowly, a profound understanding passing between them. He recognized the shape of her loss, a gaping hole that no amount of time or distance could ever truly fill. They fell silent again, but the space between them had shrunk. The initial distance of polite strangers had been bridged by the shared girders of past pain. His camera continued its methodical work, capturing the light of falling stars, but the real story was unfolding here, on the ground, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. Another meteor blazed across the sky, and they both let out a soft "ooh" in unison, a sound of childlike delight that felt strangely hopeful in the wake of their sad revelations. Damian found himself thinking that he had travelled to the ends of the earth seeking solitude, a way to seal himself off from the possibility of another heartbreak. Yet here, in the most desolate place he could find, he felt a connection more profound than any he'd experienced in years. He looked at Carmen, at the way the starlight caught in her dark hair, and felt a quiet longing that had nothing to do with loneliness and everything to do with her. As the hours wore on, the night grew colder. The initial warmth of the evening had bled away into the vast, refrigerated desert, leaving a distinct chill in the air. Carmen shivered, pulling her thin jacket tighter. "Here," Damian said, his voice a low murmur. Without ceremony, he picked up his blanket and draped it around both their shoulders, creating a small, shared tent of warmth. The move was practical, yet it felt deeply intimate. Suddenly, the space between them was gone entirely. She could feel the solidness of his shoulder against hers, smell the faint, clean scent of his shirt mixed with dust and travel. Under the shelter of the blanket, the conversation resumed, softer, more confessional. The spectacular theatre of the meteor shower gave them the courage to speak of things usually kept in shadow. "It was a car accident," Carmen said, her voice barely a whisper, the word she hadn't spoken to a stranger in years. "He was on his way to a conference. There was a storm. He was so excited about a new paper he was presenting on binary star systems. How two stars can be caught in each other's gravity, orbiting a common centre of mass for millions of years." Her throat tightened. "I hated the universe for a long time after that. Hated the stars. They felt like a betrayal." Damian listened, his own past unfurling in response to her honesty. "Mine was a quieter kind of crash," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "A slow erosion. Her name was Chloe. She wanted a home, a garden, kids, a life. She wanted me to choose that life over this." He gestured vaguely at the open road, the world beyond the observatory. "I told myself I was a wanderer, that it was in my blood. But the truth is, I was a coward. The thought of staying in one place, of being that responsible for someone else's happiness, it terrified me. So I let her go. And I've been wandering ever since, trying to prove to myself that I made the right choice." They sat in the weight of their shared histories, two souls defined by loss. Carmen by a love stolen from her, Damian by a love he had let slip away. They found a strange mirrored solace in their parallel pains, the guilt, the regret, the suffocating loneliness that followed. A meteor of impossible brilliance tore across the entire sky, a long, fiery trail of incandescent blue and green that lit up the desert floor for a fleeting second. They both gasped, a single, sharp intake of breath. In that moment of shared awe, Carmen turned her head, and her cheek brushed against the rough fabric of Damian's jacket. He turned his head at the same instant. Their faces were inches apart. The air grew thick, charged with something new and potent. It wasn't just empathy anymore. It was a fragile, terrifying spark of attraction. His eyes, blue even in the starlight, searched hers, and in their depths she saw her own pain reflected, but also a quiet longing that resonated with a frequency she thought had died within her forever. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, and her breath hitched. "I stopped believing in chance encounters after everything," Carmen whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Damian's gaze was intense, holding her in hers. "Maybe some things aren't chance," he replied, his voice a low caress. "Maybe they're just written." He didn't lean in. He didn't move at all. He gave her the space to retreat, but she didn't. She stayed right there under the shelter of his blanket, their shared breath misting in the cold night air. The rhythm of their breathing began to sync, quiet cadence against the silent flashes of the dying meteor shower. In his eyes, which reflected the last of the falling stars, she saw a pain she recognized, and a hope she was terrified to feel herself. He understood. He didn't just listen, he understood. And for the first time since Leo's death, the vast, empty space inside her didn't feel quite so infinite. The magic of the night was finite. As the first faint blush of grey began to soften the hard black edge of the eastern horizon, a new reality began to assert itself. The stars, which had been their confidants in their canopy, started to fade, retreating like shy ghosts before the approaching sun. The cold, which had been a reason to draw closer, now just felt like cold. The unspoken question hung between them, heavier than the silence had ever been. What now? The bubble they had created under the falling stars was about to burst, exposed by the harsh, clarifying light of day. It was Damian, the man accustomed to departures, who made the first move. He shifted, the blanket falling from Carmen's shoulders, and the sudden loss of his warmth was sharp and immediate. "Well," he began, his voice trying for a casualness it couldn't quite find as he started to gather his camera gear. "It was a truly incredible night. Thank you for sharing it." Each word was a small, polite stone, rebuilding the wall between them. A night. A beautiful, singular event now concluded. An anecdote for a future blog post. A memory. Carmen felt a panic rising in her chest, cold and sharp. The old Carmen, the one who had driven out here seeking solitude, would have nodded, offered a simple "you too," and watched him drive away, accepting the transient beauty of the moment. But she wasn't that Carmen anymore. Not after this night. The thought of the silence returning, of this fragile, profound connection dissolving with the morning mist, was unbearable. "Wait." The word was quiet, but it stopped him cold. He turned back to her, his hand frozen on his camera bag. "Is that all it was?" she asked, and was horrified to hear her own voice catch, thick with a vulnerability she hadn't shown anyone in years. "Just a night?" Her question stripped away his carefully constructed defences. He looked at her, truly looked at her in the growing pre-dawn light. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, the desperate plea to not let this moment vanish. He saw his own reflection there, a man on the run, not from a place but from a feeling, the feeling of wanting to stay. His entire adult life had been a series of beautiful goodbyes. He was an expert at them. He could appreciate a moment for its fleeting perfection and then move on, unburdened. It was his survival mechanism. But as he stood there, the thought of just walking away, of getting in his car and driving back to his solitary road, suddenly felt unbearable. It felt wrong. It felt like leaving a crucial part of himself behind, here in the red dust of the Outback. What if... Carmen's voice was stronger now, bolstered by a surge of desperate courage. What if this wasn't chance at all? She was echoing his own words from hours before, turning them from a poetic observation into a direct challenge. She was asking him to be more than a wanderer. She was asking him to believe his own words. The distant call of a kookaburra rattled through the awakening bush, a stark, real-world sound that signalled the end of their nocturnal trance. The ground felt hard and cold beneath her feet. Damian looked from Carmen's searching face to the vast, empty road stretching out from the observatory, the road that had always been his answer. For the first time, it didn't look like freedom. It looked like an escape. The sun broke the horizon, spilling liquid gold across the ancient sleeping land. The light was no longer harsh or invasive. It was warm, gentle, and full of promise. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air between them, turning them into a glittering temporary galaxy. Damian let go of his camera bag. He took a step back toward Carmen, closing the small distance he had created. He looked down at her, his expression stripped of all pretense, all the easy charm of the well-travelled blogger. What was left was something raw and wonderfully real. "No, Carmen," he said, his voice low and certain, answering the question that still hung in the air. It wasn't just tonight. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was electric, a confirmation. It was a beginning, if you'll let it be. Relief washed over Carmen so powerfully her knees felt weak. A single tear she hadn't realised she was holding escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Yes, she breathed the word, a prayer and a promise. Yes, please. He didn't crush her in a passionate embrace. It was something far more tender, more meaningful. He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tear. He looked into her eyes, and she saw in them a decision being made, a path being chosen. The wanderer was choosing to stand still, and then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fiery pent-up passion, but one of quiet, profound recognition. It was soft and hesitant at first, a question, and then it deepened as she responded, a mutual affirmation. It tasted of chamomile tea, cool night air, and the faintest hint of salt from her tear. It was a kiss that sealed the end of one story and began another. When they parted, they simply stood there for a moment, foreheads resting against each other, breathing in the new day. The observatory loomed behind them, a monument to the night that had brought them together, but their focus was entirely on each other. "I have a shoot in the Daintree rainforest next week," Damian said, his voice a murmur against her skin. "After that, my schedule is flexible. I can change it. I can come back." "I have a class to teach on Monday," Carmen replied, a small, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes, "about stellar nurseries, places where new stars are born." The symbolism was not lost on either of them. "My number is..." They exchanged numbers, their fingers brushing, the simple act feeling more significant than any contract. They made a plan, a real, concrete plan. He would call her Tuesday. He would drive back down in 2 weeks. They acknowledged the distance, the complications, the separate lives they had lived until 12 hours ago. But for the first time, those obstacles felt like bridges to be built, not walls to keep them apart. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows from the lonely acacia trees, a sense of peaceful resolution settled over them. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something far more precious, a real and deeply moving beginning. As the first rays of dawn touched the ancient land, they knew this wasn't just a night under the stars. It was the start of their own constellation, drawn not by chance but by the undeniable pull of two souls finally finding their way home. The vast open desert stretched before them, no longer a symbol of their isolation, but a shared and hopeful horizon. feathers and ink. The air in Blackwood Cemetery always tasted of memory. It was a crisp, metallic flavour that clung to the back of Ilara's throat, a blend of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the cold, unyielding patience of stone. For 2 years, this flavour had been the prelude to her ritual, the start of a pilgrimage she made every morning, rain or shine. She walked with a gentle but weary grace, her 53 years etched not in harsh lines, but in the soft, shadowed hollows beneath her eyes. Her path was a familiar map of grief, winding past the stoic angels and sleeping lambs until she reached the simple granite slab that read, "Thomas Gable, beloved husband, the music is not over." Ilara never spoke to the headstone. The words felt hollow, stolen by the wind before they could land. Thomas wasn't in the cold ground, he was in the echo of a shared laugh, the phantom warmth of a hand on her back, the scent of sawdust that still clung to his old workshop. Her ritual was for her a way to anchor, the day before it drifted away. "It isn't the dead I speak to, Thomas," she thought, her fingers tracing the cool engraved letters. "It's the memory of us. The ink is for me, the words are for what remains." From the deep pocket of her wool coat she pulled a folded sheet of thick cream-coloured paper. Using a fountain pen with a nib as fine as a feather, she had filled it with the quiet minutiae of her life, the leaky faucet she'd finally fixed, the surprising sweetness of the late-season tomatoes, the way the morning light still caught the dust motes dancing in the sunroom, just as he'd loved. It was a conversation with a ghost, a monologue of love that refused to fade into silence. But her pilgrimage had a second secret stop. Midway between Thomas's plot and a newer section of the cemetery stood a magnificent ancient oak. Its branches were gnarled, arthritic fingers reaching for the autumn sky, its trunk a fortress of grooved, moss-dusted bark. In its side, about heart-high, was a hollow, a smooth, dark wound in the wood that had become her postbox. With a reverence that felt almost sacred, she slipped the letter inside. The hollow smelled of history, of rich soil and something wild. For 2 years it had been the silent keeper of her sorrow, but not today. This morning, as she reached into the familiar darkness, her fingers brushed against something unexpected. Not just the smooth, cool wood, but paper. It was foreign to her touch, thinner than her own luxurious stationery, crisp and dry, folded into a sharp, neat rectangle. Her heart gave a painful, startled lurch. A trespass, an intrusion. She snatched her hand back as if burned, then, overcome by a sudden fierce curiosity, she reached back in and pulled the note out. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was not her elegant looping script. It was a man's hand, bold and angular, written in a simple black ballpoint pen. The words were few, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. "I thought I was the only one who spoke to the trees. For what it's worth, I hear you, and I understand." Ilara stood frozen, the note rattling in her hand. The world, which had been muted and predictable for so long, suddenly crackled with a terrifying, vibrant static. The crunch of leaves under a distant walker's feet, the caw of a crow from a bare branch, the scent of the coming frost, it all rushed in, sharp and overwhelming. Her solitary ritual, the quiet cornerstone of her life, had been breached. She looked from the note to the oak, then across the way to the newer graves. Someone was watching, someone was listening, someone understood, and she couldn't decide if it felt like a violation or a miracle. She folded the note carefully, its sharp creases a stark contrast to her own soft-edged letters, and slipped it into her pocket. As she walked away, she did not look back. The air still tasted of memory, but now it held a new, unfamiliar flavour, the electric tang of a question mark. For the first time in 2 years, as she left the gates of Blackwood Cemetery, Ilara felt something other than the quiet ache of absence. She felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear, mingled with a whisper of something she hadn't dared to feel in a very long time: hope. The first frost arrived the following week, a delicate lacework of silver that glittered on the headstones and turned each blade of grass into a shard of glass. The world had grown colder, starker, and yet a strange, hesitant warmth had begun to bloom within Ilara. It lived in her coat pocket, in the crisp, folded note she reread a dozen times a day. She wrote her next letter to Thomas with a different kind of energy. The words were still for him, but they were shadowed by a new awareness, a sense of an unseen audience. After she had tucked it into the oak's hollow, she found herself lingering, her gaze drifting across the cemetery. She saw no one. The secret was safe. 3 days later, a reply was waiting. Thus began their anonymous chorus. They were careful never to cross paths, their visits to the oak tree timed like the changing of a silent, unseen guard. He would leave a note, and days later she would find it. She would reply, and the space in the tree would remain empty until, one day, it wasn't. His name was Liam. He revealed it in his third letter, a simple signature at the bottom of a page torn from a practical spiral-bound notepad. He wrote that he visited his younger sister, gone too soon. He didn't offer details, and Ilara didn't ask. In return, she shared Thomas's name. They were two shores of the same quiet sea of loss, their correspondence a message in a bottle tossed between them. Their early letters were philosophical, tentative explorations of a shared landscape. They wrote of memory, of how it could be both a comforting quilt and a crushing weight. "I think grief is like a phantom limb," Liam wrote, his blocky letters marching across the page. "You know it's gone. The doctors have told you it's gone, but you can still feel it ache when the weather changes. Today, the weather is changing." Ilara found herself anticipating his words, the simple, unadorned honesty of them. He wrote like a man who built things steady and direct, while her own prose was more like a garden, full of winding paths and hidden blooms. "My husband used to say that hope was a stubborn weed," she wrote back on her thick cream paper. "You could try to stamp it out, but it would always find a crack in the pavement to grow through. For a long time my world has felt like solid, unbroken concrete. Your letters, I think, are becoming a crack in the pavement." Slowly the intimacy deepened. The anonymity became a cloak of courage, allowing them to confess the small secret shames of grieving. He admitted to feeling a flash of anger when he saw fathers walking their daughters down the aisle. She confessed that just last week she had laughed, a deep, rolling laugh at a silly joke on the radio, and the sound had been so foreign that it had immediately dissolved into tears of guilt. "My sister loved the rain," Liam's next letter read. "She said it was the sky's way of washing the world clean. She'd stand outside in it, arms wide open, and just let it soak her. Some days, I stand here and wish it would wash me clean too." Ilara read his words while a cold November rain streaked down her kitchen window. She could almost see it, a young girl, vibrant and alive, welcoming the storm. And a man, years later, standing in the same rain, wishing for an impossible absolution. A magnetic tension was building between them, a pull born not of glances or touches, but of souls laid bare on paper. With every letter, the space between their two plots in the cemetery seemed to shrink, the ancient oak no longer a divider, but a bridge. She didn't know the sound of his voice or the colour of his eyes, yet she knew the precise cadence of his sorrow. She was beginning to realise that you could fall in love not with a person but with their words, with the shape of their heart on a page. The fear she had first felt was dissolving, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning trust. The question mark was still there, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a promise. Winter arrived in earnest, burying the cemetery in a thick, sound-muffling blanket of snow. The world grew quiet, forcing its inhabitants inward. The correspondence in the oak tree too turned inward. It was Liam who made the first move into truly personal territory. His question simple yet profound. Tell me about a perfect day with him. The request sent a tremor through Alara. A perfect day? There had been so many. How could she choose just one to offer this kind stranger? She decided on a memory from long ago, before the lines of care had settled around her eyes, before Thomas's hair had been shot through with silver. A memory that also included her sister. She wrote for hours, the ink from her feathered pen flowing like a river breaking through a dam. She described a sweltering July day 30 years ago, when she, Thomas, and her younger sister Clara had piled into their beat-up convertible for a trip to the coast. She wrote of the wind whipping through their hair, of Clara's infectious, bubbling laugh as she sang off-key to Fleetwood Mac on the radio. She described the taste of cheap roadside ice cream dripping down their hands in the heat, and the gritty feeling of sand between their toes. We felt infinite, she wrote, her heart aching with the sweet, sharp pain of the memory. Lying on that beach, with the sun on our skin and the whole of our lives stretching out before us, we were immortal. Clara found a jay feather, a brilliant sash of blue, and tucked it into her hair like a crown. She looked like a wild queen. She painted the day in vivid, sun-drenched colour, deliberately omitting the darkness that had fallen on the ride home. She folded the letter, a thick, multi-page confession of a perfect stolen moment, and left it in the snow-dusted hollow of the oak. Liam's reply was delayed. For a week, the hollow remained empty. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. Alara's mind raced. Had she shared too much? Had her portrait of happiness been too painful a reminder of his own loss? When his letter finally appeared, it was a single sheet, the handwriting tight, almost constricted. The tone had shifted from gentle camaraderie to something haunted. Your letter was beautiful, Alara. It sounds like a day I would have wanted for my own sister. She was so full of life like that, always chasing the sun. He then wrote about her, about how she died too young, on her way home from a trip with her best friend. Alara's breath caught. A cold dread, slow and creeping, began to prickle at the edges of her consciousness. It was 30 years ago, he wrote, on a back road not far from the coast. Route 7, a patch of gravel on a sharp curve. They never stood a chance. Route 7. Alara's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. The room began to swim. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. A cruel, impossible coincidence. She read on, her eyes scanning the words with a frantic, horrified intensity. I was a volunteer firefighter then, just a kid really. We were the first ones on the scene. I pulled a girl from the passenger seat before it was too late for anyone else. I never knew her name. I just remember the feather she had tucked in her hair. It was blue. The pen dropped from Alara's numb fingers, clattering onto the floor. The deafening silence of the snow-covered world outside rushed in, filled with the ghost of a scream she hadn't let out in 30 years. The jay-blue feather. Her feather. Clara's best friend, Liam's sister. He didn't just understand her grief. He had been there at its birth. He had held it in his hands. The letter lay on the polished surface of her writing desk, an ordinary object that had detonated her world. Alara stared at it, the neat, angular script now looking like jagged shards of glass. Liam, the man whose words had become a lifeline, whose quiet empathy had coaxed a stubborn weed of hope to grow in the barren soil of her heart. He was the boy from her nightmare. Her study, usually a sanctuary of warmth and quiet contemplation, felt like a cage. The frantic, unsteady rhythm of her own heartbeat was a drum against her ribs. She stood up and walked to the window, wrapping her arms around herself. Outside, the snow-covered cemetery was a landscape of peaceful, monochromatic white. A perfect, beautiful lie. Beneath that pristine surface lay a history of violence and sorrow, a truth that now connected her to Liam in the most intimate and horrific way imaginable. He saved me. The thought was a physical shock, a jolt of lightning that lit up the darkest corners of her memory. She could suddenly feel the terrifying scrape of metal, smell the acrid smoke, taste the blood in her mouth, and through the haze of pain and confusion, she could see a face, young, terrified but determined, a boy leaning into the wreckage, his hands reaching for her. "I've got you," he'd said, his voice cracking with adrenaline and fear. "Just hold on, he saved me, and for 30 years I've carried the ghost of the girl he couldn't. His sister, Clara's best friend Sarah. Her mind was a storm. How could it be? How could fate be so cruel and so kind in the same breath? The man who was a comfort for her grief was inextricably linked to its very source. The stranger who had pulled her from the brink of death was the brother of the girl whose loss had shadowed her entire adult life. A wave of nausea washed over her. Guilt. It was a familiar poison, but now it had a new, unbearable potency. She had lived. She had loved Thomas. She had known decades of quiet joys and gentle sorrows, while Sarah's life had been extinguished in an instant. And Liam had spent those same decades mourning his sister, haunted by the memory of an anonymous girl with a feather in her hair. This beautiful, fragile connection they had built, this sacred space in the hollow of an oak tree. Was it all built on a foundation of tragedy? A secret she had kept from the world, and now from him? He looked up out of the letter. She could retreat. She could stop writing, disappear back into the silence, and leave him to wonder. She could preserve the purity of what they had shared, this anonymous chorus of two wounded souls. It would be easier, safer. But his words echoed in her mind. "I hear you, and I understand." He had understood more than he ever knew. He had been listening for 30 years. To run now would be the ultimate betrayal, not just of him, but of the girl she had been, the survivor he had pulled from the wreckage. He deserved the truth. He deserved to know that the life he saved had been a life worth living. It was a debt she had not even known she owed. With a trembling hand, Elara picked up her feathered pen. The ink felt impossibly heavy. She took a fresh sheet of her cream-coloured paper, but her usual flowing prose abandoned her. There were no paragraphs, no poetic metaphors left. There was only the stark, terrifying truth. She wrote only 10 words, her handwriting shaky and unfamiliar. "I know that road. I was in the car. Please, meet me at the oak tree. Sunrise." She folded the note, her movements stiff and robotic. The finality of the ink on the page felt like a verdict. She had no idea what would happen when he read it, what dawn would bring. She only knew that their anonymous chorus was over. The silence was about to be broken, and she was terrified of what she would hear in the echo. Dawn broke reluctantly, spilling soft watercolour hues of rose and pale gold across the snow-covered landscape. The air was achingly cold, so still that Elara could hear the soft crunch of her own boots on the pristine snow. Her breath plumed in front of her, a visible manifestation of the life churning inside her chest. She stood by the oak tree, her hand resting on its rough ancient bark, drawing strength from its silent endurance. She saw him approach from the far side of the cemetery, a solitary figure moving through the rows of sleeping stones, a silhouette against the burgeoning light. As he drew closer, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic wild bird beating against its cage. This was him, Liam, a man she knew intimately and not at all. He stopped a few feet away. He was tall, with a quiet intensity in his posture, his face weathered by time and sorrow, but his eyes were kind. They were the eyes of the boy who had reached for her in the darkness. A long heartbeat-like silence stretched between them, thick with 30 years of unspoken history. The air crackled with it. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and a flicker of recognition, of a memory buried deep beneath decades of grief, crossed his face. It wasn't a sudden dramatic realization, but a slow, dawning comprehension, like the sunrise itself. He didn't need to ask. His voice, when it came, was raspy, full of a fragile wonder. "The feather," he said, the two words holding the weight of a lifetime. Ilara could only nod, a wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath. Tears she had held back for 30 years finally fell, hot against her frozen cheeks. They weren't just tears of sorrow, but of gratitude, of catharsis, of an impossible, painful beauty. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic retelling of that terrible day. They didn't need to. The trauma was a chasm between them, but they chose not to fall into it. Instead, they began to build a bridge across it, one quiet word at a time. He spoke of Sarah, her laugh, her terrible taste in music, her fierce loyalty. Ilara spoke of Thomas, his steady presence, his gentle humour, the way he had patiently helped her piece her shattered life back together. And for the first time, Ilara spoke of Clara without the crushing weight of guilt, sharing a memory of her sister that made Liam smile. They were giving faces to the names in their letters, transforming ghosts back into people, their shared grief finally finding a voice. "All these years," Liam said, his gaze lost somewhere in the pastel sky, "I mourned my sister, and I carried the memory of a girl I couldn't save. I never let myself think about the life I did save. I never let myself hope she was okay." "And all these years," Ilara replied, her voice thick with tears, "I felt like a ghost, a survivor who didn't deserve to be. You were the first person who saw me, really saw me, both times." He looked at her then, and the chasm disappeared. In its place was a connection so profound, so forged in the crucible of fate, that it left them both breathless. He didn't just save her life, he'd returned to it decades later to help her truly live it. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadow across the snow, Liam reached out and took her hand. His grasp was warm, solid, real. After months of paper and ink, of words and whispers, the simple, profound connection of flesh and bone was a homecoming. Her hand, which had held a pen to write of loneliness, now rested in the hand that had pulled her from the darkness. They stood there for a long time, two solitary souls no longer alone, while the first bird song of the morning broke the sacred silence. In the quiet language of loss, they had found a grammar for hope, realizing that the deepest roots of love often grow in the very places we believe to be barren. The story of feathers and ink was over, but the story of Ilara and Liam had just begun. The world had shrunk to the size of a window pane. Beyond the leaded glass, a thick white fog pressed in, erasing the line between the sea and the sky, swallowing the jagged peaks of the Craving that were supposed to be the main attraction. For 10 days, the Isle of Skye had been nothing but a ghost of itself, a place of muted sounds and blurred edges. It suited Alessa's mood perfectly. Her husband, Marco, had called it a convalescence. "The clean air will do you good, my love," he'd said, his voice laced with the practical concern that had defined their marriage. "The city smog suffocates you. Go, breathe." But the air here wasn't clean. It was heavy, saturated with salt and damp and the smell of wet earth. It filled Alessa's lungs with the same oppressive weight that had settled on her spirit. The illness had receded, leaving behind a profound weakness, a weariness that seeped into her bones. Worse, it had stolen her words. The poet in her had gone silent, leaving only a hollow ache where rhythm and metaphor used to live. She sat in a worn armchair, a tartan blanket over her knees, and watched her neighbour. His cottage was a near identical twin to hers, a squat stone building hunkered down against the wind, no more than 50 feet away. He was a myth wrapped in shadow, an American, the innkeeper had told her, a photographer, Elias, a name as solid and spare as the man himself. He moved with a heavy, deliberate stillness, as if the very air he displaced was a burden. Most days he would sit on his own porch, methodically cleaning the lenses of his camera, the brass and steel components gleaming even in the diffuse light. Then he would sling the worn leather strap over his shoulder and walk directly into the fog, disappearing completely. Hours later, he'd return, his dark hair slicked with mist, his jacket soaked, his expression unreadable. He never seemed to carry anything back but the camera on his chest. He moves like a man who has seen the end of the world, Alessa thought, her fingers tracing the rim of a cold teacup, and is in no hurry to find the beginning of a new one. I think I understand. The silence between their cottages was a living thing, punctuated only by the mournful cry of gulls and the distant rhythmic sigh of the waves against the cliffs. And sometimes another sound would cut through the quiet, the sharp metallic click of his camera's shutter. It was a sound of finality, of a moment captured and pinned down. She wondered what he found to photograph in the endless featureless grey. Was he too documenting the void? On the 11th day, a restless energy propelled her from her chair. She wrapped a thick wool shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the small stone porch, leaving the cottage door ajar. The damp air was a shock, instantly chilling her skin. She breathed it in, a shallow, careful breath that ended in a familiar betrayal. A tickle, then a rasp, then a full-body rattling cough. It seized her, doubling her over the porch railing. Her lungs burned, tears pricking her eyes. She fought for breath, each gasp ragged and loud in the profound quiet. When the spasm finally subsided, she was left trembling, leaning against the cold stone, utterly spent. And then she saw him. He had emerged from the fog so silently he might have sprung from the earth itself. He stood a few feet away, a ghost in the mist, holding a simple glass of water. He offered it to her without a word, his expression obscured by the gloom, but his gesture was one of simple, unambiguous kindness. Alessa straightened up, embarrassed, and took the glass with a shaky hand. "Thank you," she managed, her voice a hoarse whisper. She drank, the cool water soothing the raw fire in her throat. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His face was all harsh lines and angles weathered by sun and wind, his eyes a deep, startling blue, even in this colourless world. They held a profound, ancient weariness. "The damp gets in your bones here," he said. His voice was a low gravel, rough with disuse. The American accent was unmistakable, flattened by years away from home. You learn to live with it, or it swallows you whole. She handed the empty glass back to him, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second. His were cold, firm. "I am Alessa," she said, finding her voice. "My husband." He thought the air would help. She ended with a small, self-deprecating smile. "Elias," he replied. He didn't smile back. He just watched her, his gaze steady and intense, as if he were trying to find the right aperture to see her through. The fog swirled around them, a thick living curtain. For the first time since she'd arrived, Alessa didn't feel like it was isolating her. It felt like it was holding them together in a small shared pocket of the world. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken presence of another soul. He gave one last nod, then turned and dissolved back into the mist, leaving Alessa alone on the porch, the taste of clean water on her tongue and the echo of his voice in the air. The fog, as if by some unspoken agreement, began to recede. It didn't vanish entirely, but thinned into a gauzy veil, revealing a world of dramatic, sweeping beauty. The sky was a canvas of bruised purples and moody greys, and the sea, now visible, churned with a restless energy. The landscape was stark and primal, and for the first time, Alessa felt a flicker of something other than melancholy. It was awe. Feeling her strength slowly returning, she began to take short, hesitant walks along the cliff path. She never strayed far, her lungs still a fragile barometer of her exertion. On the third day of this new routine, she saw Elias emerge from his cottage, his camera, as always, his silent companion. He watched her for a moment as she navigated the muddy track, her steps uncertain. "There's a place," he called out, his voice carrying easily on the wind, "sheltered just a little further." She paused, surprised by the invitation. "I don't want to intrude on your work." He shook his head, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "The ghosts don't mind." He started walking, and after a moment's hesitation she followed. He led her away from the cliff's edge, inland toward a shallow, green valley, where the skeletal remains of a village stood against the sky. It was a crofter's settlement, abandoned for a century or more, the stone walls of the cottages crumbling, their roofs long since surrendered to the elements. The wind whispered through the empty doorways, a lonely, keening sound. As they walked among the ruins, the silence between them began to fill with words. It started small. He asked about Italy. She asked about America. But soon the conversation deepened, drawn out by the profound solitude of their surroundings. "I feel like these stones," Alessa confessed, running her hand over the rough lichen-spotted wall of a roofless cottage. "Solid on the outside, but hollow within. My words, they have gone. It is as if the illness washed them all away, and I am left with nothing but silence." Elias was quiet for a long time, framing a shot of a single defiant thistle growing from a crack in a hearthstone. The click of the shutter was the only reply. Then he lowered the camera. "Words can be a lie," he said, his gaze fixed on the flower. "They dress things up, make them prettier or uglier than they really are. Sometimes the silence is more honest." He spoke guardedly about his work, calling it reportage. He never used the word war, but he spoke of places where the silence was a scream, where the dust was made of memories people wanted to forget. He spoke of Vietnam. He showed her how he saw the world, urging her to look through the viewfinder. The world shrank, became focused, intense. He had framed a shot of a fallen wall, the way the afternoon light caught the vibrant green moss clinging to it. Through his lens, it wasn't decay, it was tenacity. It was life persisting against all odds. "You photograph what is," she said, her voice filled with a newfound understanding, the hard truth of it. She looked around at the empty homes, at the ghosts he'd mentioned. "I write about the feelings left behind, the echoes. Perhaps they are the same thing." He didn't answer, but a different kind of silence settled between them, one of shared comprehension. She began to tell him stories, inventing lives for the families who had once warmed their hands by these cold hearths. She gave them names, sorrows, and simple joys, weaving tales from the shapes of the stones. He listened, his expression softening, the harsh lines around his eyes easing. She was lost in a story about a fisherman's wife waiting for a boat that would never return when she felt it. The slight shift in his posture, the quiet intensity of his focus on her. The camera was up. She froze, feeling suddenly exposed, vulnerable, but he didn't lower it. He waited, and in that moment, she understood. He wasn't stealing her image, he was asking for it. Slowly she relaxed, turning her face slightly toward the weak sunlight, letting him see what he wanted to see. Click. Later that evening, there was a soft knock on her door. It was Elias. In his hands was a photograph, the paper still curling slightly, the chemical scent of the darkroom clinging to it. It was her. She took it, her heart thudding a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. It was a portrait, but not like any she had ever seen. He had captured her in the ruins, her hair tossed by the wind, her face pale, but there was no trace of sickness in her eyes. Instead, he had found a flicker of the fire she thought had been extinguished. He'd seen the storyteller, the survivor. He had seen a strength she had forgotten she possessed. It was the most intimate, most honest gesture anyone had ever offered her. I've spent years documenting destruction, Elias thought, as he walked back to his own dark cottage. He could still feel the warmth of her fingers where they'd brushed his. How do you photograph something being rebuilt? How do you photograph hope without it feeling like a lie? He looked back toward her cottage, where a single, warm light now burned against the encroaching twilight. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was a brooding canvas of grey. The next, the heavens opened. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, battering the small cottage. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes in their frames. Alessa stood watching the sea, now a furious churning cauldron of white foam, when the lights flickered twice, then died, plunging the room into a deep, disorienting gloom. The cold crept in almost immediately. She was fumbling for matches to light the paraffin lamp when a sharp, insistent knock came at the door. It was Elias, a dark silhouette against the tumultuous grey of the storm, his jacket already plastered to his frame. "My fire is lit," he shouted over the roar of the wind. "It's warmer. Come." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an offer of sanctuary. She grabbed her thickest shawl and followed him across the churning, muddy ground between their cottages. His cottage felt instantly different from her own. Where hers was tidy and impersonal, a rental space, his was intensely, chaotically his. Books were stacked on every surface, maps were pinned to the walls, and the air was thick with the rich, earthy scent of a peat fire that blazed in the hearth. And everywhere there were photographs, tacked to the walls spread across a large wooden table, clipped to a wire hanging across the room. They were stark black and white images of a world away from this misty island. A soldier's haunted eyes, a grieving mother's silent scream, a city street turned to rubble. It was a gallery of human suffering, captured with a devastating, unflinching honesty. The weight of his past was here, in this room, a silent, powerful testimony. The storm raged outside, sealing them in. The fire crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the walls, making the frozen faces in the photographs seem to flicker with life. The air between them was electric, charged with all the things they hadn't said. Forced into this raw proximity, there was nowhere left to hide. Alessa's gaze landed on one particular photo, set apart from the others on the mantelpiece. It was smaller, quieter, but somehow more devastating than the rest. It wasn't of a person, but of a single, worn-out child's shoe, half buried in the mud of a flooded road. "Tell me about this one," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Elias stared into the flames, his jaw tight. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained, stripped of its usual defences. "Vietnam," he said. "A village near the delta. We were moving through after a sweep. There was nothing left, just mud and silence. I saw the shoe and thought, that's the story. That's all that's left. So I took the picture." He paused, swallowing hard. "Then I saw her, the little girl, hiding in a ditch. She had no shoes. She was just staring at me." He finally turned to look at Alessa, his blue eyes shimmering in the firelight, raw with a pain that time had not touched. "They give you medals for watching," he said, his voice cracking. for being invisible, but you're never invisible. You carry every face with you. I took the picture, and then I walked away. I was a vulture, picking over the bones. The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. Alessa didn't offer him pity or empty platitudes. She offered him the only truth she had. We all have our ghosts, Elias. She moved closer, her shoulder almost brushing his. My husband, Marco, he's a good man. He loves the woman I was, the one who hosted dinner parties and laughed at all the right moments. But he's afraid of the woman I'm becoming, the one who is quiet, the one who is breaking. My great fear isn't dying. It's living a life that is only half lived, a beautiful, empty room. In that shared darkness, their separate pains found a common language. He saw her fear of fading away, and she saw his agony of having seen too much. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before they gently, reverently, traced the line of her jaw. His touch was a question, a plea, a confession all at once. She leaned into his hand, her eyes closing. The raging storm outside was a distant echo of the tempest inside her. This was wrong, and yet it was the only thing that had felt right in months, perhaps years. It was inevitable. In the flickering firelight, he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate and deep, a collision of loneliness and longing. It tasted of salt and rain and peat smoke, a kiss born of storms both inside and out. It was the breaking of a long, painful silence, and in the shelter of his cottage, with the wind screaming outside, Alessa felt for the first time truly safe. The storm broke as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the island scrubbed clean, dripping and gleaming under a sky of impossible blue. The air was crystalline, and the sun, a rare and precious gift, poured down like liquid gold. It felt like the world had been remade, and in a way it had. The boundary they had crossed in the firelit darkness of Elias's cottage had changed everything. The tentative curiosity had been replaced by a current of intimacy that flowed between them, as tangible as the light breeze. An unspoken giddiness took hold, a feeling of joyful, reckless abandon. "We can't waste a day like this," Alessa said. Her face turned up to the sun, a genuine, radiant smile transforming her features. "It feels borrowed." "Then we should spend it well," Elias replied, the ghost of a smile touching his own lips. For one perfect sun-drenched day, they became tourists in their own temporary world. He drove them in his battered Land Rover, the windows down, the fresh, clean air whipping through the car. They were no longer the poet with no words and the photographer with no voice. They were just a man and a woman, alive and together under a brilliant sky. He took her to the fairy pools where the water ran with a magical turquoise clarity over a bed of smooth stones. They took off their shoes and waded into the icy stream, their laughter echoing in the glen. He showed her how to work his camera, how to frame the world, how to find the light. She was a natural, her poet's eye translating easily to the visual medium. She captured a shot of him, unawares, his face relaxed in a way she'd never seen before and felt a possessive thrill. Later, sitting on a sun-warmed rock, she pulled a pen and a paper napkin from her pocket. The words that had been locked away for so long came flooding back, not in a torrent, but in a slow, clear stream. She wrote a short, simple poem about light and water and the startling blue of a stranger's eyes. Without rereading it, she folded the napkin carefully and pressed it into his hand. "For your collection," she said softly. He tucked it into his shirt pocket over his heart without looking at it. The day felt stolen, a perfect incandescent bubble of time. They shared stories of their childhoods, hers in a bustling, sun-baked Naples apartment, his in the vast, empty plains of Nebraska. They created a history for themselves that consisted of only this single perfect day. As afternoon bled into evening, he drove them to Niced Point. They walked the long, steep path down to the lighthouse, a stark white tower standing sentinel at the very edge of the world. They sat on the grass, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. It was breathtakingly beautiful and achingly finite. Then, as the last sliver of sun vanished, the lighthouse came to life. A brilliant white beam sliced through the deepening twilight, sweeping across the sea, over the cliffs, and across their faces in a slow, rhythmic pulse. Light, then dark, light, then dark. The steady, predictable sweep of the beam was a reminder of the world outside their bubble, a world of order, of responsibility, of promises made long ago. It was Alessa who broke the spell. "I received a letter yesterday," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the sound of the waves below. "It was from Marco. He's coming at the end of the week, to take me home." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irrefutable. Home. The word felt foreign, a place she no longer recognised. Elias didn't speak. He just watched the relentless rhythmic light. Light, then dark. "It always comes back around," he said, his voice flat. "A perfect circle. You can count on it." The unspoken meaning was painfully clear. The lighthouse beam was a circle, a constant. Their time together was a straight line, and they were standing at the end of it. The joyful abandon of the day dissolved, leaving behind a profound and tender sorrow. This beautiful, borrowed sun was setting, and they both knew it would not rise for them again. The choice was never discussed. It didn't need to be. It had been made for them years ago in other countries, in other lives. This day was a gift, a perfect memory to be stored away. It was not and could never be a beginning. The end came on a quiet, grey morning. The weather had returned to its sombre sky temperament, the sky a blanket of soft pearlescent grey, the air still and cool. The tide was out, exposing a wide expanse of dark, slick rocks and seaweed, the sea a distant, placid line. It felt like the island itself was holding its breath. Alessa was packed. Her 2 small suitcases stood by the door of her cottage, a silent testament to her imminent departure. Marco had arrived the night before, a whirlwind of cheerful, oblivious energy. He was a handsome man, with an easy smile and a proprietor's air of confidence. He had kissed Alessa soundly, declared the island air had worked miracles, and spoken at length about a dinner party they were hosting upon their return to Italy. He was the physical embodiment of the life she had chosen, the life to which she was returning. He saw her rosy cheeks and renewed energy, and saw only a successful cure. He did not see the ghost in her eyes. Now he was loading the car, humming a jaunty tune, blissfully unaware of the profound, silent drama unfolding just a few feet away. Elias stood on his porch. He and Alessa hadn't spoken since Marco's arrival. There was nothing left to say. Now, as Marco disappeared into the cottage for a final check, Elias walked across the damp grass that separated them. He stopped a few feet from her. The silence between them was vast, filled with the weight of their single, perfect day and the stormy, confessional night. There were no grand declarations, no pleas, no desperate promises. Theirs was a connection that had existed outside of language, and it would end the same way. It was a moment of profound, painful understanding. He held out his hand. In it was the photograph he had taken of her in the ruins. The black and white print was stark and beautiful. She looked strong, windswept, and alive. A woman she was only just beginning to know. "Something to remember the light," he said, his voice low and rough. Her hand trembled as she took it. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out the small folded napkin. The ink of the poem was slightly smeared. "And you?" she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. something to remember the words. She pressed it into his hand. It was an exchange of the parts of themselves they had reawakened in each other. Her rediscovered strength, his broken silence. "Thank you," she said. The words a bare breath of sound, for the quiet and for the storm. He gave a single sharp nod, his blue eyes holding hers for a long final moment. In their depths, she saw the ruins, the storm, and the sun. She saw everything. Marco came back out, smiling. "All set, my love." He put a proprietary arm around her shoulder and guided her to the car. She did not look back. Alea stood motionless as they got in, as the engine started, as the car pulled away, its tyres crunching on the gravel drive. He didn't move until the car was a small speck disappearing down the winding road. Some stories you don't tell, he thought, his hand closing around the fragile paper in his pocket. You just live them, and that has to be enough. He slowly raised the camera that hung, as always, from his neck. He looked through the viewfinder, his vision blurring for a moment. He didn't aim it down the road where she had gone. He focused on the empty porch of her cottage, on the simple wooden chair where she had sat watching the fog. He focused on the empty space, a perfect composition of loss and memory. The shutter clicked, a final quiet punctuation mark at the end of their story. For the rest of their lives, on opposite sides of the world, neither would ever hear the cry of a gull or feel the sea mist on their face without remembering the choice they made. Not for a lifetime, but for a moment that was, in its own way, enough. The Unbroken Chord. The air in the gaslight cafe was a thick, smoky soup, a concoction of stale cigarette ghosts, spilled beer, and the feverish, almost holy energy of youth on the brink of changing the world. It was late 1964, and Greenwich Village was the beating heart of that change. Eleonora Ellie Vance, however, felt like a ghost herself. She finished her final song, a crystalline ballad about a weeping willow she'd known in the gardens of her Connecticut home, and the applause that followed was polite, appreciative, but thin. It was the kind of applause you give a pretty porcelain doll on a shelf. You admire its craftsmanship, but you don't expect it to speak to your soul. Her voice, a thing of trained, bell-like purity, felt like a lie in her throat. She sang of pastoral beauty, while the newspapers screamed of fire hoses in Alabama and boys her age being shipped to a place called Vietnam. A chasm had opened between her art and her reality, and she was standing on the wrong side singing melodies that felt as hollow as a drum. She retreated from the small, scarred wooden stage, her guitar case feeling heavier than it ever had before. Then he stepped into the light. He didn't so much walk to the stage as he claimed it, his presence a low hum of electricity in the crowded room. His name was Sam Jones, and everything about him was the antithesis of her. Where she was polished, he was raw. Where her guitar was pristine, his was a battered veteran, its body covered in the scuffs and scars of a life lived hard. He didn't speak a word, just settled onto the stool, his shoulders slumped not in defeat, but with the weight of stories that needed telling. And then he played. It wasn't folk music, it was something older, deeper. It was the blues, dragged up from the Mississippi mud and steeped in the pain of generations. His voice, when it came, was the sound of gravel and whiskey, of smoke-filled juke joints and lonely roads. He sang of injustice, not in allegories or metaphors, but in stark, brutal poetry. He sang of a boy named Jimmy, a friend who wouldn't be coming home. The room, which had been a low babble of conversation, fell into a profound, reverent silence. Each note was a testament, each chord a piece of his soul laid bare. Ellie stood near the bar, frozen. He sings like he's lived 1,000 lives, she thought, a knot tightening in her chest, and every single one of them was harder than mine. What can I possibly offer a voice like that? His music wasn't just heard, it was felt. It was a physical force that rearranged the air, that made the comfortable uncomfortable and the complacent stir. When he finished, the silence held for a beat, a collective breath, before the room erupted in a roar of applause that was visceral, earned. Later, Sal, the club's owner, a shrewd man with a cigar permanently attached to his hand and an ear for what sold, cornered them both by the bar. "You," he said, jabbing the cigar toward Ellie, "you've got the voice of an angel, pure, clean, commercial." He then turned to Sam. "And you've got the fire, the grit. People are scared and they're angry. They want to hear that." He looked between them, a glint in his eye. "I want you to write together. Her polish, your guts, it's lightning in a bottle." Sam snorted, looking Ellie up and down. He saw the pressed collar of her blouse, the carefully coiffed blonde hair, the untouched innocence in her wide blue eyes. "I don't think she and I are singing the same language, Sal." "Then learn," Sal grunted before walking away. The air between them crackled. Ellie, stung by his dismissal but also drawn by the undeniable power of his performance, found her voice. "I thought your use of the dominant seventh was interesting. A little unrefined, but effective." Sam gave a humourless laugh, shaking his head as he leaned against the bar. He smelled of the road, of cigarettes and something else, something like wood smoke and earth. "Unrefined? Honey, where I come from, we don't have time to refine things. We're too busy trying to survive them." He looked at her, his dark eyes holding a challenge. "A pretty song about a willow tree won't stop a billy club, sweetheart. You have to be willing to get your hands dirty, to bleed on the page." His words were a punch, knocking the wind out of her carefully constructed world. He saw right through her, to the hollow place where her art should have been. The tension was immediate, a dissonant chord struck between two instruments that had no business being in the same orchestra. And yet, beneath the friction, something else resonated, a magnetic pull, a shared, unspoken understanding that the music they made alone was no longer enough. The world was changing, and they, whether they knew it or not, were about to change with it. The rain fell in steady grey sheets, washing the grime from the city streets and streaking the window panes of Ellie's small brownstone apartment. Inside, the world was one of quiet order. Books were stacked neatly, a metronome ticked with unshakable precision on her piano, and the air was clean, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old paper. It was a sanctuary of control, a world away from the chaotic energy of the gaslight. When Sam knocked, the sound was an intrusion. He stood on her doorstep dripping, his denim jacket soaked dark, his guitar case shedding water onto her welcome mat. He looked even more out of place here than he had at the club, a wild, untamed thing in her meticulously curated life. The awkwardness from their first meeting clung to him like the damp, a silent guest in the room. "Sorry about the floor," he mumbled, gesturing with his thumb at the small puddle forming at his feet. "It's just water," Ellie said, though her fingers twitched with the urge to wipe it up. They tried to work. They sat opposite each other, her at the piano, him on a delicate chair that seemed too small to hold him. It was a disaster. She'd offer a complex soaring harmony, a cascade of notes learned through years of classical training, and he would just shake his head. "Too many words, too many chords," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. "You're hiding the truth." He'd counter with 3 simple, powerful chords on his guitar, chords that felt like a foundation, like bedrock. But he had no melody for them, only a rhythm, a pulse. Frustration mounted. The steady tick-tock of the metronome seemed to mock their lack of progress. They were speaking different languages, just as he'd predicted. She saw music as a thing of beauty and structure, He saw it as a tool, a weapon. Finally, Ellie stood up, walking to the window and watching the rain blur the world outside. The silence stretched, filled only by the metronome and the drumming of water. "My father says this music will only bring trouble," she said softly, her back to him. "That it's unladylike. But silence feels like a betrayal, doesn't it?" Sam didn't answer immediately. He just watched her, the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she clasped her hands behind her back. She keeps her anger locked up tight behind all those pretty notes, he thought. But I can hear it. It's the same quiet hum I've been carrying my whole life. When she turned back, her composure had cracked just enough. She was holding something in her hand. It was a newspaper clipping, the edges worn from handling. She unfolded it and laid it on the piano. The headline was stark, the black and white photograph beneath it grainy and horrifying. A peaceful protest in Selma being met with truncheons and dogs. "I can't stop looking at it," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I read about it in my safe, warm apartment, and I write songs about trees." A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. It was the first truly honest thing she had shown him. Seeing that raw, unguarded emotion in her, something in Sam's own defences gave way. He looked at the clipping, a familiar ache tightening his chest. He reached into his own story, a place he rarely let anyone visit, and offered her a piece of it. "I left Mississippi because of a day like that," he said, his voice losing its hard edge. "My friend, the one I sang about, Jimmy. He just wanted to help people register to vote. He believed in the good of things. They found him by the side of the road 3 weeks later." He didn't say any more. He didn't have to. The shared grief, the shared outrage, finally bridged the gap between them. It was a sombre, sacred ground they could both stand on. Ellie sat back down at the piano. This time, when her fingers touched the keys, they didn't search for complexity. They found a simple, haunting melody that rose and fell like a lament, like the rain against the glass. It was full of the sorrow she'd been holding back. Sam picked up his guitar. He listened to her melody, and then he began to play. His 3 chords were no longer just a raw foundation. They were an anchor for her grief. He found the words, stark and real, drawn from the well of his own pain, but shaped by the new, shared understanding. They wrote about the cold cobblestones of a city street, about the sound of marching feet, about a cry for justice that was lost in the sirens. His gravelly voice intertwined with her clear, aching soprano. His raw power found its focus in her melodic grace. Against the backdrop of the rain, in the quiet of her orderly room, they created something new. It wasn't his song, and it wasn't hers. It was theirs. As the last note faded, they looked at each other over the neck of his guitar. The rain had stopped. The metronome had been forgotten. And in the quiet space between them, a new rhythm, fragile and hopeful, had begun. The recording studio was a lie, but it was a beautiful one. Tucked in the back of a dusty record shop on Bleecker Street, it was a small claustrophobic room where the walls were lined with grey, dented egg cartons, a futile but heartfelt attempt at soundproofing. Wires snaked across the floor like electric vines, and the air, thick with the smell of hot vacuum tubes and old dust, was electric with possibility. This was where music was born, where ghosts were captured on magnetic tape. Their first song, Cobblestone Cry, had been a whisper that was turning into a roar. It was being played on college radio stations from Berkeley to Boston, a bootleg recording of their first performance that had taken on a life of its own. Now, Sal had booked them 2 days in this makeshift studio to capture the lightning he'd seen and record a follow-up. They worked with a frantic, feverish energy, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a shared, driving sense of purpose. Sleep became an afterthought. The world shrank to the dimensions of this room, to the space between the notes. They worked in a proximity that was both professional and profoundly intimate. Sam would lean over Ellie's shoulder to point out a chord progression, his hand brushing her arm, sending a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the faulty wiring. She would reach across him to make a note on a lyric sheet, her hair falling across his cheek, the scent of her, clean and fresh like lavender, momentarily overwhelming the mustiness of the room. The small space became charged with an unspoken tension, a harmony that existed just beneath the music they were making. They were creating a song about holding on to hope in a world that seemed determined to extinguish it, and in the process they were becoming that hope for each other. On the second night, well past midnight, they were in the control booth, a closet-sized space dominated by a large hulking tape machine. They were listening to a playback of the final take. Murray, the engineer, a man who seemed to communicate only in grunts and head nods, had stepped out for a cigarette. The music filled the darkness. Ellie's voice, pure and soaring, was wrapped around Sam's, a lifeline of melody holding his raw, aching lyrics. The final chord hung in the air, a perfect resonant blend of their two souls, before fading into the soft hiss of the tape. Silence. It was a profound silence, heavy with the emotional weight of what they had just created together. It was their pain, their anger, their fragile hope, all woven into 3.5 minutes of sound. In the dim glow of the VU meters, Ellie could see the emotion etched on Sam's face. His usual guard was down, stripped away by exhaustion and the raw power of their own creation. He turned to look at her, his eyes dark and deep in the shadows. He didn't say anything. Words felt clumsy, inadequate for the moment. He reached out, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as they cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The touch was electric, a current that ran straight to her core. For the first time, she thought, her mind a dizzying swirl. The music wasn't just in the room, it was in me. His touch was the melody. My heartbeat was the drum. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She couldn't. She leaned into him, closing her eyes as his lips met hers. The kiss was hesitant at first, a question. Then, as she responded, it deepened, becoming an answer, a confirmation of everything that had been building between them in the unspoken glances, the accidental touches, the shared silences. It tasted of stale coffee and cigarettes and something else, something that was just Sam, a deep, resonant certainty. It was a kiss that was both a release and a vow. It sealed the partnership they had forged in music and transformed it into something more. It was a promise made in the heart of their shared creation, a quiet chord struck in the darkness. When they finally broke apart, breathless, the hiss of the tape was the only sound. Sam rested his forehead against hers, his eyes still closed. "That," he whispered, his voice raspy with emotion, "that's the one note we've been missing." He was right. It was the crescendo they'd been building toward all along, a perfect, terrifying, beautiful note that would change the key of their lives forever. The spinning reel of tape in the corner seemed to capture it all, not just the song, but the silence, the kiss, the vow. A moment of permanence in a world of static. The dressing room was a concrete box painted a sickly shade of green, located in the bowels of a large concert hall in Washington, D.C. A single, bare bulb hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to amplify the tension. Through the walls, the sound of the crowd filtered in, not the intimate applause of a folk club, but the vast, restless roar of thousands of people gathered for a march. It sounded less like an audience and more like an ocean tide, powerful and unpredictable. The success of Cobblestone Cry and the buzz around their new song, The Unbroken Chord, had propelled them out of the village and onto a national stage. But fame, they were learning, was a double-edged sword. It brought them here, to open for one of the biggest names in folk music, but it also brought scrutiny. Sal had called with a warning. A man in a cheap suit, probably FBI, had been asking questions around the clubs, asking about the troublemakers singing angry songs. And then there was the letter. It had arrived that morning, forwarded from her New York address. It was from her parents, the paper wrinkled and smelling faintly of her mother's rosewater perfume. The words were a torrent of love and fear, a desperate plea for her to come home, to leave this dangerous world of protest and radical music, to come back to the safety of the willow trees and manicured lawns. Ellie held it in her hand, the paper a tangible symbol of the world she'd left behind, a world that was trying to pull her back. Sam saw the letter. He saw the tremor in her hands, and the protective shell he had built around himself for years, the one she had so carefully started to dismantle, snapped back into place, harder and more fortified than ever. His past experiences, the ghosts of Mississippi, were no longer memories. They were present-day threats. He saw them in the shadows of the hallway, in the faceless roar of the crowd. "We're not singing it," he said, his voice flat. He was staring at the set list tacked to the mirror. His finger was pointing at the last song, the Unbroken Chord. It was their most powerful, most defiant, and most dangerous song. Ellie looked up, confused. "What are you talking about? It's our best song." "It's a target, Ellie," he shot back, his voice tight with a fear she'd never heard from him before. The lyrics, "Burn bright until the shadows flee." A single voice, 1,000 strong, can break the back of what is wrong. In this city, on this day, that's not a song, it's a provocation. They'll be watching us. "That's the point," she argued, standing up to face him. The small room felt even smaller, charged with their conflict. "The moment we let fear write our songs, we've already lost, Sam. Don't you see? This is the entire point. To be heard." "You've read about the cost, Ellie," he said, his voice rising, his hands clenched into fists. He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a desperate protective fire. "You read it in your newspaper clippings. I've paid it. I've seen what happens to people who provoke. I won't let you be the price for a song. I can't." His fear was a tangible thing, a raw living entity in the room. It wasn't for himself, she knew that. It was for her. It was a fear born of love, but it felt like a cage. The conflict was no longer about a set list or a lyric. It was about the fundamental chasm between their experiences. He had seen the darkness firsthand and wanted to shield her from it. She, having just found her voice, refused to be silenced. It was their first real fight, and it was tearing them apart, the static of the real world finally overwhelming their private melody. "So what do we do, Sam?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. "We go out there and sing about willow trees." The barb hit its mark. He recoiled as if struck. The love that had bloomed in the quiet intimacy of her apartment and the dark of the recording studio was now being tested under the harsh glare of reality. He loved her enough to want to silence her, and she loved him enough to refuse. The roar of the crowd outside swelled, a countdown to a choice that felt impossible. The glare of the spotlights was blinding, a wall of pure white heat that erased the thousands of faces in the crowd, turning them into a single breathing entity of shadow and sound. The tension from the dressing room followed them onto the stage, a third unwelcome presence. It was in the rigid set of Sam's shoulders, in the way Ellie's fingers felt slick on the neck of her guitar. They played their first two songs, their voices and instruments in perfect practiced harmony, but their eyes carefully avoided each other. The performance was flawless, professional, and completely hollow. The connection that had made their music transcendent was gone, replaced by a painful, echoing silence. Then came the final slot in their set, the moment of truth. Sam looked at Ellie, his expression a storm of conflict. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to honour their truth. The two desires were at war within him. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a final silent plea. Then he turned to the microphone and started the simple, unassuming intro to Cobblestone Cry. It was the safe choice, the song that had made them, but the one that wouldn't break them. Ellie watched him, her heart aching. She could follow his lead, sing the familiar words, and let their defiance die here, on this stage, a casualty of fear. She could choose safety, or she could choose the woman Sam had helped her become. She met his gaze across the stage, pouring every ounce of trust, of love, of conviction she possessed into that single look. Then she took a breath. Ignoring his melody, she leaned into her microphone, and with a voice that was clear and steady despite the tremor in her soul, she began to sing. A single match in a darkened room. It was the opening line of the Unbroken Chord, the forbidden song, the song of truth. A wave of shock rippled through the audience who had been expecting their hit. Sam's fingers faltered on his guitar strings, the chord dying with a discordant buzz. He stared at her, his eyes wide. This was it, the choice, laid bare for thousands to see. He looked out at the vast sea of faces, people holding signs, people hungry for a voice. He saw their hope, their anger, their fear. It was the same hope and fear that lived inside him. He looked back at Ellie. She was still singing, her eyes locked on his, trusting him to catch her. She was not the porcelain doll he had met months ago. She was fire and steel. She was brave. A slow smile touched the corner of his lips, a look of pure, unadulterated pride. He closed his eyes for a single beat, and then he changed chords. His fingers found the powerful driving progression of their anthem. He joined her, his voice meshing with hers, not in defeat, but in triumphant surrender. Their harmony, reborn in this act of mutual defiance, was more powerful than it had ever been. It soared over the crowd, a declaration not just of political conviction, but of their faith in each other. It was a musical vow renewed under the glare of the spotlights. The performance was transcendent, a moment where love and purpose became one and the same. The roar that followed was not just applause, it was a chorus of solidarity. Much later, as the first hint of dawn painted the Washington sky in shades of bruised purple and soft grey, they stood by the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool. The city was quiet now. The energy of the march faded into an exhausted, hopeful peace. The water was a perfect still mirror, reflecting the monument and the vast, quiet sky. They were bone-weary, but the tension between them had dissolved, replaced by a profound, unshakable calm. Sam reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "My whole life," he said, his voice soft in the pre-dawn stillness. "I've only ever sung about what was lost. With you, I'm finally singing about what's worth fighting for." Ellie leaned her head on his shoulder, the rough denim of his jacket a familiar comfort. We didn't know what tomorrow would bring, another hit song or a government file, but his hand was in mine, and for the first time the future felt less like a threat and more like a song we had yet to write. He didn't promise her it would be easy. He didn't promise her safety. He promised her something better. He promised they would face the static together, a two-part harmony against the noise. In an age of noise and fury, their love was not a quiet shelter from the storm, but the most defiant song of all. The orchard keeper's promise. The final turn of the lane was a memory etched so deep in Charlotte Vale's soul that her hands tightened on the worn leather of her reticule before her eyes even registered the view. It had been 10 years since she had fled this corner of the Sussex countryside. A blushing bride on the arm of a man who had promised her the world and had, in the end, left her with nothing but his name and a silence that echoed louder than any cannon. Now, in the late spring of 1847, she was simply Mrs. Vale, a widow at 28, returning not in triumph, but in retreat. The carriage wheels slowed, their rhythmic crunch on the gravel path a sound that vibrated up through the floorboards and into her bones. Outside the window, the world was a riot of untamed green. Hawthorn hedges, thick and thorny, spilled onto the lane, their white blossoms like fistfuls of scattered pearls. The air that drifted through the open window was thick, sweet, and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth, burgeoning life, and something else. The faint, ghosting perfume of apple blossoms. Her heart gave a painful thud. Home, or what was left of it. After the driver had unloaded her modest trunks, leaving them like sentinels by the sagging gate, the carriage rattled away, its departure sealing her in a profound quiet. She was alone. Before her stood her late uncle's legacy, a 2-story stone cottage, its windows dark and watchful, and beyond it, the orchard. She walked towards the trees, the hem of her grey morning dress whispering against the tall, wet grass. The air here, it remembered her, even if she had tried so hard to forget. Every rustle of the leaves felt like a whisper of the girl I once was. The orchard was a wreck, a beautiful, tragic wreck. Branches, heavy with leaf but sparse with blossom, clawed at each other, a tangled knot of woody limbs reaching for a sun they could barely find. Weeds choked the ground, and the air of neglect was as palpable as the dampness clinging to the bark. It felt like a mirror to her own heart, a place of once vibrant potential, now overgrown with the thorns of grief. Her fingers, pale and trembling slightly, reached out to touch the gnarled trunk of a familiar giant, its bark a topography of shared history. This was the one, the old sentinel at the edge of the grove. It was beneath this very tree that Gabriel Hughes had stolen her first kiss, a clumsy, breathless collision of lips that had tasted of sunshine and unripe apples. The memory was so vivid it made her ache, a phantom limb of a life she'd never lived. "It has missed a woman's touch." The voice came from behind her, deep and steady as the earth itself. It was a voice she hadn't heard in a decade, yet knew as well as her own name. She turned slowly, her heart a frantic bird in her ribs. It was him, Gabriel Hughes. The boy was gone, replaced by a man forged from labour and time. His shoulders were broader, his jaw stronger, set with a sternness she didn't recognise. His hair, the colour of dark honey, was ruffled by the breeze, and his eyes, those startlingly clear grey-blue eyes, held a reserved, unreadable expression. His hands, resting at his sides, were calloused and stained with soil, the hands of a man who spoke the language of the land. He held no hat, a sign of respect that felt both practised and strangely intimate. "Gabriel," she breathed. "Name a soft puff of air." "Mrs. Vale," he corrected gently, his gaze unwavering. The formality was a chasm between them, wider and deeper than the 10 years that had passed. The air crackled, thick with unspoken questions and the ghosts of 2 teenagers who had once carved their initials into a tree not 20 feet from where they now stood. I've come to see to my uncle's affairs," she said, her voice sounding thin and reedy to her own ears. He nodded, a short, sharp dip of his chin. "I heard. A good man, your uncle. He loved this place." His eyes swept over the tangled branches, a flicker of something, sadness perhaps, or frustration, crossing his features. "The old place needs a firm hand, Miss Vale." He caught himself, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "Charlotte, the trees have been waiting." The use of her given name, even as a correction, was a spark in the heavy air. It was a slip, a glimpse of the boy beneath the stoic farmer. He offered no apology, simply stood there, a solid presence against the backdrop of decay. "I wouldn't know where to begin," she confessed, a wave of despair washing over her. The task felt monumental, impossible. He considered her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her sensible but impractical dress, her pale city hands, the weary slump of her shoulders. He seemed to see not just the woman she was, but the girl she had been, and the gulf that lay between the two. "I can help," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a gesture that felt less like a neighbourly kindness, and more like a duty he was compelled to fulfill. "If you'll have me, for your uncle's sake, for your uncle's sake." The words were a careful boundary, a line drawn in the dirt between them. She knew she should refuse, that his presence here would only stir memories best left buried, but looking at the wild, broken orchard, feeling the profound weight of her own solitude, she knew she couldn't. She needed help. She needed him. "Thank you, Gabriel," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I would be most grateful." He gave another short nod. The matter settled. And as he turned to point out a branch afflicted with canker, explaining the remedy in his low, steady voice, Charlotte felt a fragile tendril of hope unfurl within her. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. The orchard was in ruin, and so was she. But perhaps, just perhaps, together they could learn to grow again. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the trees. It began with the sound of Gabriel's steady footfalls on the path just after dawn, and it ended with the long shadows of evening striping the orchard floor. Their silence at first was as thick as the overgrown underbrush they cleared. It was a silence of history, of things left unsaid, of a path cruelly diverged. But the work became their bridge. They didn't speak of London or her late husband, or the years he'd spent toiling on his family's neighbouring farm. Instead, they spoke of the earth. Gabriel taught her the arcane language of the orchard, the difference between a water sprout and a fruit-bearing spur, the telltale signs of root rot, the delicate art of grafting new life onto old stock. His voice, once so guarded, would soften when he spoke of the trees, a quiet passion burning through his reserve. Charlotte, in turn, proved a dedicated student. She found a strange solace in the physical ache of the labour. Pruning the dead wood felt like clearing the cobwebs from her own soul. Her hands, once soft and pale, became scratched and calloused, and she wore the dirt beneath her fingernails like a badge of honour. She was no longer just a widow in mourning. She was a woman at work, fighting for something to live. One sweltering afternoon, she was wrestling with a particularly stubborn branch on a gnarled pippin tree. It was dead wood, thick as her wrist, and refused to yield to her saw. Frustration pricked at her, sharp and hot. "You're fighting it," Gabriel's voice said, close behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. "Let the saw do the work." He stepped forward, his body close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He reached around her, his large soil-stained hands covering hers on the handle of the saw. The contact was a bolt of lightning on a clear day, a jolt of pure, unadulterated awareness that shot up her arms and settled, warm and fluttering, in her chest. His skin was rough against hers, his presence solid and overwhelmingly male. For a breathless moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to shrink to that single point of contact, the sounds of the orchard, the buzzing bees, the rustling leaves, fading to a distant hum. He guided her hands, his voice a low murmur against her ear. Slow, steady strokes. Find its rhythm. Together they moved the saw back and forth, and the dead branch finally gave way with a satisfying crack, thudding to the ground below. They sprang apart as if scalded, the space between them suddenly charged with a tension that had nothing to do with stubborn branches. Gabriel cleared his throat, turning his attention to the fallen limb with an intensity that was wholly feigned. Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild and unfamiliar beat. Later they took their midday meal of bread, hard cheese and cool water from the well. Without discussion, they settled in the shade of the old sentinel tree at the edge of the grove, their kissing tree. The memory of that day hung between them, as tangible as the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. It was a shared secret, a silent testament to a story that had never been finished. Charlotte risked a glance at him. He was staring out across the rows of trees, his expression thoughtful. "My uncle always said you could hear the secrets of the orchard if you listened long enough," she said softly, breaking the silence. "I think I'm only just beginning to learn its language." Gabriel turned to her, his gaze holding hers. A flicker of a smile touched his lips, a rare and precious thing. He was right. These trees, they remember everything. Who planted them? Who cared for them? Who neglected them? He picked up a fallen apple blossom, its petals already browning at the edges, and rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. They remember the girl who used to climb their branches without a care in the world. He looked at her then, and for a moment the stoic farmer vanished, and she saw the boy he'd been, the boy who had looked at her with such open, unguarded adoration. He saw it too, the reflection of his own memory in her eyes. He looked away quickly, his jaw tightening as the mask of impassivity slid back into place. She still looks at the world with that same wonder, he thought, a familiar ache twisting in his gut. I had thought the years would have taken it. I had thought I had taken it. He stood, dusting the crumbs from his trousers. "The sun is moving," he said, his tone once again brisk and practical. "There's a section of Bramley's that needs attention before evening." As he walked away, Charlotte remained seated, her fingers tracing the rough bark of the tree. The warmth of his hand on hers still tingled on her skin. The work was mending the orchard, yes, but it was also tending to roots she thought had been severed long ago, uncovering a connection that had lain dormant, waiting beneath the surface of the years. Summer settled over the Sussex countryside, heavy and ripe. The days grew longer, the work in the orchard more intense, and the space between Charlotte and Gabriel smaller. The physical boundaries they had so carefully maintained began to blur. A shared look over a row of trees, a hand offered to help her over a tangle of roots, the easy companionship of their shared lunches. Each was a small thread, weaving them closer together. The breaking point came, as it so often does with a storm. It rolled in from the west one afternoon, a bruised purple mass of clouds that swallowed the sun and turned the vibrant greens of the orchard to a sombre, brooding grey. The first drops of rain were fat and lazy, splattering against the dusty leaves. Then the heavens opened. A torrential downpour descended, turning the orchard paths to rivulets of mud and plastering their clothes to their skin in seconds. "The cottage!" Gabriel yelled over the roar of the rain, grabbing her hand. His grip was firm, urgent, and she didn't hesitate. They ran, laughing breathlessly like children, splashing through puddles until they tumbled onto the stone porch of the keeper's cottage, dripping and gasping for air. Inside, the small space was dim and smelled of old paper, wood smoke, and damp stone. The rhythmic drumming of rain on the slate roof was a constant hypnotic beat, enclosing them in a world of their own. The storm showed no signs of abating. They were trapped. To combat the chill, Gabriel built a fire in the hearth, his movements efficient and sure. The flames caught, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room, painting his strong features in shades of orange and gold. While he worked, Charlotte, seeking to busy her hands, turned to a dusty wooden chest in the corner, her uncle's old records. She sat on the floor by the fire, the chest open before her, and began sorting through the contents. Ledgers filled with her uncle's spidery script, receipts for feed and tools, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Curiosity piqued, she untied them. They were drafts of letters from her uncle to her father, written nearly 9 years ago. Her brow furrowed as she read the worried, pleading words. "I must implore you to reconsider," her uncle had written. "The Hughes family are good people, honest farmers. To call in this debt now, after such a poor harvest, would be their ruin. It is a debt of honour, I understand, but surely compassion must temper justice." A cold dread trickled down Charlotte's spine. She read on, her uncle's words painting a picture of desperation. He wrote of Gabriel's father, a proud man forced into a terrible position. He wrote of Gabriel himself, a young man of 18 with a bright future, forced to abandon any plans for his own farm to work his family's land to the bone, just to keep their heads above water. She looked up, the letters trembling in her hand. Gabriel was watching her, his face a stony mask, but his eyes were dark with a storm of their own. He had seen the letters. He knew what she was reading. "The summer before I left," she whispered, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "You stopped coming to the fence. You stopped looking at me." Gabriel's jaw worked, the muscle clenching and unclenching. He stared into the fire, his voice low and rough when he finally spoke. "Your father came to see mine. He was polite, a gentleman. He simply stated that the loan, made in good faith years before, was now due. In full. We had nothing. The blight had taken nearly half the crop." The air in the small cottage grew thick, heavy with the weight of this long-buried secret. This was the ghost that had haunted them, the true reason for the silence, the distance. It wasn't just that she had left, it was that he had been forced to let her go. "He said," Gabriel continued, his voice raw, "that it would be unwise for the son of a debtor to be seen courting the daughter of a man of property. He made it clear my place was here, far below yours." Tears pricked Charlotte's eyes, hot and shameful. "Oh, Gabriel, I never knew." All these years she had carried her own narrative of their ending, a story of youthful fancy and circumstance. She had never imagined the brutal, calculated cruelty of it. "All these years," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was the only one with a ghost at my shoulder. You carried one too." The sight of her tears seemed to break something in him. The rigid control he held over himself finally fractured. He turned from the fire, his eyes shining with an agony he had suppressed for a decade. "Some debts aren't settled with coin," he said, his voice cracking. "They're paid in silence." In distance he took a ragged breath. "Do you think I wanted to let you go? I saw you in that carriage, Charlotte, riding away to a new life, and I stood here, tethered to this land by your father's chains, and I swore I would never let myself feel that way again. I would never hope for something so far out of my reach." He confessed it all then, that he had never stopped thinking of her, that his stoicism was a shield, his silence a penance. He had built a fortress around his heart to keep from breaking it a second time, and in the warm, firelit intimacy of the cottage, with the storm raging outside, Charlotte rose to her feet and closed the distance between them. She didn't offer platitudes or apologies for her father's sins. Instead, she reached out and laid a hand gently on his arm, a silent offering of shared sorrow. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, and in his eyes she saw the walls of his fortress finally begin to crumble. The rain fell, washing the world clean, and inside the small stone cottage 2 hearts began, tentatively, to heal. Just as a fragile sense of hope had begun to take root in the orchard, the blight arrived. It came not as a sudden storm, but as a creeping pestilence, a sinister whisper on the early autumn air. It started on the lower branches of the copse's orange pippins, presenting as ugly brown spots on the leaves, which soon curled and withered as if touched by frost. Within a week it had spread. The apples themselves, which had been swelling with the promise of a bountiful harvest, began to show the same telltale blemishes, a sickness spreading just beneath the skin. Desperation coiled in Charlotte's stomach, cold and sharp. The orchard was more than just land and trees. It was her solvency, her purpose, her one tangible link to a future she was trying to build. To lose it now, after they had poured so much of themselves into its revival, felt like a uniquely cruel twist of fate. The village, which had been watching her progress with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, began to whisper. Old resentments against her proud London family surfaced like weeds. "It's a cursed plot," she overheard one woman mutter at the market. "Pride comes before the fall, they say." The words stung, isolating her further, but she was not alone. The crisis which could have driven them apart instead forged Gabriel and Charlotte into a singular, determined force. The blight was not a ghost of the past they had to navigate. It was a physical enemy, a tangible threat they could fight together. All his reserve vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective energy. "We won't lose it," he stated, his jaw set, his eyes blazing with a fire she'd never seen. "Not this. I won't let you lose anything else." His knowledge of the land became their greatest weapon. He showed her old remedies passed down through his family, a pungent spray made from copper and lime, the importance of burning the afflicted leaves to halt the spread. Their days became a frantic race against the creeping decay. They worked from sunrise until the last light failed, their hands and clothes perpetually stained, their bodies aching with a weariness that went bone deep. The true test came during a week of damp, chilling weather that the blight seemed to thrive on. Gabriel announced they would have to light smudge pots, small, smoky fires, throughout the night to raise the temperature around the trees and ward off the damp. That night was a descent into a smoky, surreal hell. The air grew thick and acrid, burning their throats and making their eyes water. The orchard, which had been a place of burgeoning life, was transformed into a hazy, fire-lit battlefield. They moved like wraiths through the smoke, their faces smudged with soot, their movements economical and synchronized, born of shared purpose. They didn't need to speak. A look, a nod, a shared glance was enough. In the deepest hour of the night, with the moon a hazy smudge behind the smoke, they paused for a moment near the centre of the grove, leaning against each other in their shared exhaustion. The world was silent save for the crackle of the small fires and their own ragged breathing. In the flickering, uncertain light, Charlotte looked at Gabriel. The soot on his face couldn't hide the deep lines of fatigue around his eyes, or the fierce determination in his gaze. All the barriers between them, the years, the secrets, the class divide, had been burned away, leaving only this raw, profound connection. In the face of ruin, I felt no fear, she thought, a sense of wonder cutting through her exhaustion. There, with his hand in mine, amidst the smoke and the dying leaves, I had never felt more alive. Almost unconsciously she reached out, her fingers gently brushing a smudge of soot from his cheek. It was an act of simple, unguarded tenderness. He stilled, his breath catching. Then he captured her hand, not pulling away, but pressing her palm flat against his cheek, holding it there. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a man starved for comfort. The gesture was his surrender. It was his choice. In that smoky, desperate night, he was no longer the boy forced to stand aside, but the man choosing to stand with her, to fight for her. He opened his eyes, and the look he gave her held all the words he'd never been able to say. He would not let her fall. They would face this, and whatever came next, together. The air was thick with smoke, but for the first time they could both see their future clearly. The battle against the blight was not a decisive victory, but a hard-won truce. They lost a portion of the crop, but they saved more than they lost. The apples they harvested were smaller, some slightly blemished, but they were theirs, wrested from the brink by sheer will and shared labour. Charlotte, with Gabriel's help, spent weeks pressing cider and baking pies, her small cottage kitchen filled with the warm, spicy scent of cinnamon and cooking apples. When the night of the annual village harvest festival arrived, the air was crisp and clear, smelling of wood smoke and frost. The village green was a galaxy of bobbing lanterns, casting a warm, celebratory glow on the faces of the community. In the centre of it all, on a long trestle table, sat Charlotte's offerings, golden-crusted pies and jugs of dark amber cider. When people tasted them, their expressions of surprise, then delight, were a balm to her weary soul. She had not just saved a harvest, she had earned a place. Then the fiddler struck up a lively country dance. The music was a joyful, foot-stomping tune that seemed to pull everyone into its orbit. Charlotte watched from the sidelines, a small smile on her face, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She felt a presence beside her and turned to see Gabriel. He looked different tonight, washed clean of soot and soil, wearing a simple but clean shirt. He had always held himself apart at these village functions, a quiet observer on the periphery. But tonight, his eyes were fixed on her. Without a word, he held out his hand. It was no longer the hesitant, careful hand of their early days. It was a firm, confident, open invitation. Her heart leaped. Taking his hand was more than just accepting a dance. It was a public declaration. She placed her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers, warm and sure. He led her into the swirling throng of dancers. They moved together with an effortless grace, as if they had been dancing together their whole lives. He swung her out, and she laughed, a genuine, full-throated laugh that felt like a release. As he drew her back in, his arms securely around her waist, their eyes met over the heads of the other dancers. In the warm lantern light, they were the only two people in the world. The whispers of the village gossips faded away, replaced by the triumphant music of the fiddle. Later, when the dancing had slowed and the moon was high in the sky, he took her hand again. "Come with me," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. He led her away from the fading lights of the festival, down the familiar lane and back through the gate of the orchard. Their orchard. The trees stood as dark, sleeping silhouettes against the star-dusted sky, their branches bare, resting after their long fight. The air was still and cold, but full of the quiet promise of spring. He led her to the heart of the grove, stopping beneath the ancient gnarled branches of the kissing tree. It stood as a silent witness to their entire story, to the boy and girl who had been, and the man and woman they had become. He turned to face her, his hands finding hers in the darkness. He didn't have a grand, poetic speech. His words were as simple and true as the earth beneath their feet. "Charlotte," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "When I was a boy, I dreamed of a life I thought I could never have. A life with you. Then I spent 10 years trying to forget that dream." He squeezed her hands gently. "Working here, with you, it brought that dream back to life. I don't have much to offer, just calloused hands and a heart that's been yours since the first blossom. Let's build a life here. Let's plant new roots, see new seasons, together." Tears streamed freely down her face, tears of joy, of relief, of a happiness so profound it ached. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Gabriel. Yes." He released one of her hands to gently cup her face, his thumb stroking away a tear, and then he kissed her. It was not the clumsy, breathless kiss of their youth, nor the desperate, smoke-filled moment of their crisis. This kiss was deep and sure, a kiss that held the memory of the first and the promise of 1,000 more. It was a kiss that tasted of autumn air and sweet cider and finally of home. And in the quiet heart of the orchard, Under a blanket of stars, she realised a promise made by a boy had finally been kept by a man. A promise not of a life without winter, but of a love strong enough to tend the roots and wait always for the spring.